And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. We want to get into arguably what is the biggest story of the day regarding former President Donald Trump and special counsel Jack Smith. This is what we know here, that federal prosecutors today issued a revised version of an indictment accusing former President Trump of plotting to overturn the 2020 election, stripping out some charges in order to help it survive the Supreme Court's recent ruling granting former presidents broad immunity for official acts in office. Well, former President Trump issued quite the lengthy diatribe there on Truth Social. This was one part of it. He said in response, quote, in an effort to resurrect a dead witch hunt in Washington, D.C., in an act of desperation and in order to save face, the illegally appointed, quote unquote, special counsel, deranged Jack Smith, has brought a ridiculous new indictment against me, which has all the problems of the old indictment and should be dismissed immediately, all caps. His Florida document hoax case has been completely dismissed. This is merely an attempt to, all caps, interfere with the election and distract the American people from the catastrophes Kamala Harris has inflicted on our nation, like the border invasion, migrant crime, rampant inflation, the threat of World War III, and more. So former President Trump not taking this lying down, not taking this well at all here on Truth Social. In the meantime, though, we want to bring into the conversation our friend, legal analyst and former federal prosecutor, Neama Rahmani, to help us make sense of what Jack Smith did today. He joins me. Neama, good to see you here. We thought of you. We had to get you on. We got to talk about this. What is Jack Smith up to here? I've heard the words that this is a revising of the previous indictment or a reframing of the previous indictment. Now, from what I understand, and I'm not a lawyer, superseding means additional charges in an additional indictment. We didn't see that here, did we? Why?
You're absolutely right, Andrew. Normally when prosecutors go back to the grand jury and get a superseding indictment, they're piling on, they're adding more charges. That's not what happened here. In fact, Jack Smith did the opposite. He removed some of the allegations, even though we're still dealing with the four same claims, essentially conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruct an official proceeding. Based on the U.S. Supreme Court's immunity ruling, Jack Smith wanted to take out some of the allegations that might fall into one of those immunity categories. And without getting into legal weeds too much, the Supreme Court's majority opinion said there's three categories: core constitutional acts that are absolutely immune, other official acts which are subject to immunity but they can be rebutted, and personal private acts that are not subject to immunity. So when it came to communications with Justice Department officials, and one of the unindicted co-conspirators there was Jeffrey Clark, Jack Smith took out those allegations because those were communications with cabinet officials and their appointees. And with respect to Mike Pence, obviously he was a individual who was vice president and his job was to certify the election, but also someone that was running for president again with Donald Trump. And we know that campaign activities are historically personal, private, not official. So what Jack Smith tried to do was reframe some of the allegations related to former President Mike Pence as campaign and personal acts, not official ones.
Okay, yeah, Neama, let's talk about some of that reframing here. The Fox News Brain Room has one of the examples to illustrate the point. In the old indictment, there were more than 30 references to the Justice Department in text. In the new indictment, no results were found when searching for the Justice Department in the text of the new indictment. Now, let's talk about that. The Associated Press says this, that in its decision on immunity, the Supreme Court ruled Trump cannot face criminal charges related to any of his interactions with Justice Department officials, finding that a president's dealings with the department were part of the core official duties of his office. That seems pretty cut and dry, I think, to a lot of viewers. It does to me here, about what Jack Smith was trying to do, kind of eliding and deleting any reference to the Justice Department, because it was found in the ruling by the Supreme Court that a president can communicate and interact with their own Justice Department on whatever, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the few concrete examples that was actually in the Supreme Court's opinion. So obviously Jack Smith wants to comply with that. And That was deemed to be a core constitutional duty, which means you can't charge it, nor can you introduce any evidence of it at trial. So that would all be reversible error. So Jack Smith, despite what some folks may argue, has been very conservative in how he's charged Donald Trump. I'll give a few examples. He didn't charge him with insurrection or seditious conspiracy, like some folks had wanted, which would have potentially disqualified him from public office. In the classified documents case, he filed it in Florida, which was a less favorable venue than Washington, D.C., because he didn't want to deal with a motion for a change of venue. And now what we're seeing here is he's trying to be more surgical. And we saw this even in the original indictment itself. He didn't take a Fani Willis kitchen sink approach. He didn't charge everyone like Giuliani and Mark Meadows and others. He wanted just focused on Donald Trump. And now he's even focusing those charges even more because we know obviously Trump is going to file a motion to dismiss this case, both in terms of Jack Smith being appointed, that appointment violating the appropriations and the appointments clause. We know Judge Cannon in South Florida agreed, but also on classified immunity. So we know that motion is coming. So this is more of a defensive maneuver to make that indictment a little bit more bulletproof for Judge Tanya Chutkan in D.C., who's going to rule on that motion.
Neama, let's talk about how we characterize where this case is, because you can make the argument it's somewhat been frozen in place since last December because of the immunity question hanging over it. Now that the Supreme Court, has ruled on the immunity question, at least partly, they also partly threw it back to the lower courts here. Is that why Jack Smith took this chance today, or was this always in the offing? Was Jack Smith and his team there in the special counsel's office going to have to respond either way about the direction of this indictment and the direction of this case in the wake of the immunity ruling from the Supreme Court? Or was it a complete surprise here? Is this a Jack Smith wholly undeterred by the immunity ruling here, clarifying how he is going to navigate this going forward?
It's Jack Smith trying to tailor that indictment to the Supreme Court's decision, both in terms of the immunity case and the obstructing an official proceeding case. He has his eyes on not just the trial court, but the appellate courts. And we know that this case will go to the D.C. Circuit, like it has once before. And again, likely to the Supreme Court that will decide whether the allegations in this case, were they personal acts or were they official? And are they subject to immunity? Because we know, based on Supreme Court precedent, that that determination is immediately appealable. Just like the judge stayed the case the first time around, so this issue could be sorted out by the Supreme Court. Because let's be honest, we haven't dealt with immunity in a criminal case since Nixon. There has been some litigation with respect to Bill Clinton and others about civil lawsuits. So now that we know what the law is, the judge in the case is going to have to decide, were these acts personal? Were they official? Is Trump immune? And once that decision is made, that case is going to go back up on appeal. And this time around, Jack Smith wants to be safe and make sure there's nothing in that indictment that the conservative justices in the Supreme Court might take issue with.
Okay, but some of Jack Smith's detractors and opponents are describing this as a do-over, that he's getting a second shot now in the wake of the immunity ruling. Would you characterize that as that, or no? Is that inaccurate to describe it as that?
Well, it is somewhat of a do-over, but let's be honest, none of us knew what the Supreme Court was going to do on presidential immunity because it was really uncharted legal waters. So even if the case were dismissed based on immunity, usually that dismissal wouldn't be with prejudice if there was something alleged that would be personal. And the challenge that we're having in this case fundamentally is historically, campaigning is personal. It is not official. And that's pretty well established. But Donald Trump, of course, is arguing, and his lawyers have been very successful in saying, well, this is the head of state who is making sure that we have free and fair elections. This isn't about Donald Trump, the candidate. This is about the head of the executive branch to make sure there is no widespread voter fraud, whether it be in 2020 or some other time. So that's the challenge that the prosecution and the defense are having. Is this election integrity, or is this campaigning? Because obviously the law is very different with respect to the two.
Yeah, in the new indictment on page 7, Jack Smith says this, that the defendant was on notice, that his claims were untrue. He was told so by those most invested in his reelection, including his own running mate and his campaign staff. And I'm somewhat certain that that is new language included in the indictment there, that Jack Smith is alleging that Donald Trump, while espousing these false claims about election fraud, he knew that they were false. And that's been the crux of this indictment throughout the whole course of this case. How can Jack Smith and his team prove that claim in a court of law here? Let's talk about Jack Smith's timeline, though. So it's a two-track timeline because he's have two cases in front of him here that he has brought, one that he's trying to salvage in Florida as well after Judge Cannon dismissed it. He made a filing to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals just yesterday, urging them to reinstate the classified documents case that he brought against former President Trump as well in the wake of Judge Cannon's dismissal. So that is ongoing, and then this is ongoing in D.C. here. He's got a lot on his plate. When can any of this be resolved, if at all?
Well, if Donald Trump wins in November, it will never be resolved because he can't be prosecuted. A sitting president, pretty well established under Department of Justice, a long-standing policy, cannot be charged, cannot be tried. So all his cases go away. So under the assumption that Kamala Harris wins in November, the question is what happens to these two federal cases? Well, in South Florida, Judge Cannon took a pretty surprising view of Jack Smith's appointment, saying that he needed to be confirmed by the Senate. Now, no other federal judge in this country has taken that view of special counsel appointments, and they've been appointed for decades. For instance, Hunter Biden is being prosecuted in Los Angeles, where I am, next month by a special counsel that was not confirmed by the Senate, at least here in California. He was the U.S. attorney in Delaware, but of course, a Delaware prosecutor doesn't have jurisdiction here in California. So that was a pretty surprising decision. That is what's going up on appeal to the 11th Circuit. And we know that Judge Cannon has been reversed multiple times. So there's the very real possibility that that case goes back. And now Judge Cannon needs to decide the case, not based on Jack Smith's appointment, but whether former President Trump was immune based on the Supreme Court decision like we're dealing with in D.C. And of course, in D.C., Judge Cannon will make that ruling. It'll go back up. But importantly, none of this will happen before the election. So the election really is going to determine what happens with Donald Trump's criminal cases.
Yeah, and let's just talk about more hypotheticals. Say Trump does win the election here. Is he in his right? Is it under his purview if he is the executive of the executive branch? Can he tell whoever he might appoint as his attorney general that he wants these cases dismissed? Can he do that? Has it been done before, if not?
Well, it's never been done before, but he can absolutely do that, and it should be done based on longstanding precedent. Jack Smith should dismiss these cases if Donald Trump is reelected. And if not, when Trump takes office, he can appoint any attorney general he wants. Merrick Garland won't be there, and he can fire Jack Smith. So I think Jack Smith will see the writing on the wall if the election goes in Donald Trump's favor. And both cases should be dismissed in pretty short order. And I would expect the same thing to happen in Georgia as well, even though it's a state case, even though it hasn't been addressed. The same legal analysis and logic would apply. So there's a possibility that the only case that Donald Trump has to deal with, at least as far as criminal, is that New York hush money case, which of course is the least serious of all.
Yeah, speaking of New York, we have a live picture there outside the Fox News World headquarters in New York. Neama, I think you and I are going to be talking on September the 18th when that sentence is expected to be handed down. We know that Trump's legal team has asked the judge for a delay in the sentencing date. Haven't heard an answer on that question or a resolution on that question just yet. But Neama, it is fast approaching here.
It is, and it was supposed to be even earlier in September, and it got pushed out so the judge can hear some briefing on this immunity issue. I think in that case, obviously there's no special counsel, so we don't have to deal with that argument. But really it comes down to immunity. I think that's a very tough argument for Trump to win. Now, there were some communications with Hope Hicks and others that were part of his administration that arguably shouldn't have come in based on the Supreme Court's decision. But we're really talking about conduct, an alleged affair, a payment, some reimbursement, the vast majority of which most people would say, well, it's personal, right? You're having an affair, you're paying money to keep it quiet. It's your personal lawyer. How is this an official act? So I think that's going to be the toughest argument for Trump's lawyers to win. I think given the judge in that case, how he's ruled so far, Judge Juan Merchan, I expect him to lose that argument. I expect him to be sentenced. I don't think he's going to get prison time or even home confinement. We're likely seeing a sentence of probation sometime in mid-September.
Yeah, it is very interesting. You know, you and I spoke so often in early spring and early summer about how we thought these legal cases would have a, outsized impact on the 2024 election. And how the summer somewhat changed that calculus, not only with Trump getting shot at that campaign rally in Butler, PA, but also President Biden withdrawing from the top of the ticket here. So it's been quite an interesting year, and we'll see what effect or what impact these cases have going forward. Only 70 more days till the election. Neama Rahmani, as always, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Talk to you soon.
All right, in the meantime here, we do have more comments coming from former President Trump there in this multi-part post and thread on Truth Social as he is still reacting to what Jack Smith did today. Trump goes on to say this: for them to do this immediately after our Supreme Court victory on immunity and more is shocking. I've also been informed by my attorneys that you're not even allowed to bring cases literally right before an election. A direct assault on democracy, Trump says. This is an unprecedented abuse of the criminal justice system. The case has to do with, quote unquote, conspiracy to obstruct the 2020 presidential election, when they are the ones that did the obstructing of the election, not me. They cheated on the election, and they go after me for cheating on the election. Interestingly, this comes at the exact same time as Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook has admitted to concealing massive amounts of information, such as Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, which is a direct acknowledgement that the 2020 presidential election was manipulated and rigged by the DOJ. What they are doing now is the single greatest sabotage of our democracy in history.